Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you for show number 97. We are rapidly approaching 100 episodes, and we'll probably do some kind of live goofiness when we get to that 100th episode. But for today, if you are watching on YouTube, then you can see I have guest Scott Pilutik with me here. And if you're not watching, then you'll soon hear him. If you're checking us out on Google Play, Stitcher, iTunes, or other podcast players. But let's go ahead and get right into our talk here. I have been very excited to have Scott on here, and I don't want to waste any time getting to it. Hi, Scott. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone.
Yes, for sure. Now, you are a lawyer, and you are also you're associated with Tony Ortega's underground bunker as well. Is that what's your association with that?
Well, I met Tony years ago, and even before meeting him, I knew of him since my critic past goes all the way back to the mid to late 90s, back in the alt.religion, Scientology days. And Tony was one of the few brave journalists doing great work. And so I eventually met him at a party, I think, and we hit it off. And I've been, happy to help him ever since. Initially I thought, after he left The Voice, that he was going to do, just a weekly, column, but that soon grew into what we know today. And Tony keeps me busy in the background. There's plenty of legal issues that come up in the natural course of his business. So I'm very happy to be that help.
Awesome. It's great work. And you've answered a few questions for me, just have been very, very helpful. In me producing some of my content where I've had some questions about, I only have a layman's understanding of things like libel and slander and what you can get away with and what you can't, and what you can say and what you can't. And you've been very helpful in that regard. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So there are all kinds of questions I've had stored up here waiting to talk to somebody with a legal background who actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to the Church of Scientology. There are so many comments, so many things. I'm sure you see them all over the bunker all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And, they come in, they're perennial questions. They never really die. They're really the same questions that everybody's been struggling with. Going back all the way into the 90s when the internet first met Scientology head on. So
right.
So yeah, I'm very used to those questions. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and I'll try to see if I can bring some new variation on some of these, or we'll see where this goes. Sure. But I myself am intensely curious what some of the answers are to these. So first off, now being as close to the bunker as you are and being a Scientology watcher and whatnot, you've seen up close what's happened with Scientology legally. We have the Garcia fraud case, the DeCrescenzo forced abortion suit, the Rathbun suit that got dropped, which was, if I remember right, basically a stalking and harassment, stop stalking and harassing us kind of a suit.
Right.
And then you've seen what's gone down in Germany and France. And so I guess my first question is kind of a broad one, is what's your take as a lawyer on attacking Scientology on the legal front? Is that a viable option for people? It seems to me that, it would cost an arm and a leg, yeah, and very rarely results in anything productive or effective.
Yeah, I mean, the key, if you're going to sue Scientology, would be to keep the issue very, very focused and small. I think a lot of people... Well, before I would go there, I would say that Scientology is, because they have limitless resources, can afford to expand the scope of any litigation and and all those little sidebars and side trips, they cost a lot of money, and there's really no and that's on purpose, of course, and it's by doctrine, as you know. The idea is to just outspend you, and you can see every one of these cases. I mean, you mentioned the Rathman case that started out as a harassment case, and it soon became an anti-SLAPP case, and then it soon became an issue before the Supreme Court, having nothing to do with harassment whatsoever. And appeals lawyers cost a lot of money, yeah, I mean, you're probably looking at easily six figures by that point, and with not a lot of hope necessarily of return on that investment, risk, or I'm not sure investment's the right word, but
right.
So it's tough. It's definitely almost always a mistake to sue them, unless you have all your ducks in a row and you're looking at something. You're looking at attacking them on a very explicit front. Right.
You'd have to have it really worked out beforehand. And these are all civil suits now we're talking about. So what's your take on going after Scientology from a criminal aspect? I mean, I think the closest they've ever come that I recall is Lisa McPherson, right? Because you're dealing with wrongful death, possibly. I mean, there was false imprisonment. There were real criminal issues on the line with that one. They sort of out-PR'd their way out of that. A lot of schmoozing, a lot of money laid down to a lot of people, as I understand it, to sort of create that. I don't know what term to use, but they schmoozed a lot of people. And then, of course, they got the medical examiner to change, what she had was going to write or had written, threw a lot of pressure on her personally.
Yeah.
So those are extra courtroom, sort of extracurricular activities that they did to avoid criminal prosecution. But did Florida really have a case there? Could they and should they have gone after them despite all that schmoozing and money spending, or
Well, the state or the federal government is really no different than a litigant necessarily, a plaintiff. They have a budget, and there's a very good chance that budget's going to be exhausted pretty quickly. And
we're kind of talking about where the rubber meets the road with state and federal prosecution. It's like, hey, that costs money too.
Right, and I think that that explanation holds for I don't want to go down the full IRS rabbit hole, but I think that's that was a big consideration for the IRS too. It was just not having enough money to they have to go back to their town boards or whatever and say and justify the reason for why this is carried on for 5 years or whatever, with no end in sight. And of course that's by design. I did think that I was actually I worked with Ken Dandar on the civil side of that lawsuit, so I can't really talk about the Lisa McPherson thing with respect to that side. But on the criminal side, I mean, and much of my memory of that whole, of everything that went on there is probably past its expiration date. But yeah, what Joan Wood, was it Joan Wood? I forget now.
The medical examiner.
The change from from suspicious to accidental was a crushing blow. I mean, it would have had the state would have had a very uphill climb at that point without Joan Wood on board. And my memory of that of her change, the basis for that change was fairly specious. I mean, it was really almost indefensible. But she was a person under an immense amount of pressure, and I think I forget exactly what happened to her, but I think she broke not long after that.
She did, yeah. I know she retired and, not in the public eye, and Scientology just ruined her.
Right, and I think she died not that long after. Wow. I just realized I'm going on the record here, so I better be right, but I'm pretty sure Joan Wood met a sad end.
Yeah.
Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong.
No problem. No, it was not a pretty picture. And I really have always considered that time period was the most threatening to David Miscavige personally, because he was directly involved. I mean, if it had gotten into a courtroom that he had been the one directing actions that were taken with her prior to her psychotic break, and that somehow had contributed to that, and then the church had engaged in what it engaged in, which, was absolutely, not cool. I mean, the whole introspection rundown and all that stuff. I think he was looking at, this has to be like all resources, to the hilt to keep him protected. And unfortunately, they have enough money to throw around that it worked,
Yeah, it ultimately did work.
Well, I didn't realize until we just got to talking here that you're OG. I mean, you go back to ARS days.
Yes. Yeah.
And what is that? Just explain that to people.
Before websites, really. I mean, the websites existed, but they were really in their infancy. In the early 90s, there was a sort of group messaging mechanism or convention, and they were news groups, and there was alt.religion.catholicism, alt.religion.scientology, as it turns out. And there's a really fun history behind the creation of that Scientology's attempts to remove it, which were kind of impossible because of the decentralized nature of the internet, but hilarious, of course. And so that's what sort of drew me in. And I watched for a while, and then eventually I started participating anonymously. And then they somehow outed me, and I've sort of been lurking around ever since, being involved in one aspect or the other. I picketed Scientology back in the 2000 or 99 in Clearwater.
Wow.
So yeah, I've been around for a while.
Wow, it's been a long battle, and I think you've been watching it since the old days, so you've seen the progression and the the mushrooming that occurred when Anonymous hit the line,
right,
and how it just went global and was just unstoppable after that.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that when Anonymous got involved, you could basically add 2 zeros behind whatever the number of critics were at that point, and I felt a little better, not being as involved as I was, because it seemed like we were suddenly in safer hands, and
right.
And it seems like it every time they do something stupid, it mushrooms a little bit more, like you said. So
yeah, they're not doing themselves any favor in the PR department these days. All right, well, let's get back to some legal stuff. Now, there was a guy named Larry Wallersheim who went after the church, and I think that case goes all the way back to the 80s. Do you remember the specifics of this?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, there were so many aspects of the Wallersheim case, so you'll have to be explicit, because I knew some aspects better than others.
Well, it's the end of the case that I'm most interested in. Now, he went after them, and he succeeded, and this was noteworthy, that he succeeded in getting them all the way into the courtroom and getting them to settle. and pay him money. Now, it took like a decade between the settlement and the actual here's your check, but it did happen. But that's to me, that's the question I have, and I wanted to pick your brain on this, was I'm told, and I'm not familiar enough with the case to know for sure, but I'm told that this case was the one that came closest to legally piercing the corporate veil and getting into the courtroom how the church is really set up and how it's run and how Miscavige controls everything. And so I wanted to ask you, what did you know about that aspect of it? Because what I was told was when the day or, the week or something that was all going to come into the courtroom and the corporate veil was finally going to get, pierced and whatnot, the church went, oh, nope, settlement, we're going to settle, and the case stopped, and that was that. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I wanted to pick your brain on that.
Yeah, I'm not so familiar with the actual litigation that you're talking about, like
Okay.
that day, and whether that wasn't being dramatized for effect or not. It is true, though, generally, though, that Scientology, if faced with discovery into their own books, after all the First Amendment defenses that they had set up have failed, will almost certainly buckle, because they really don't want courts and judges picking through their books. I mean, I think they're pretty well structured to withstand those attacks, just because of purely by the Byzantine nature of the corporate structure, which is very difficult to understand and very few people actually do. There's a nominal top parent corporation of RTC, but then there's also CST, and there's an interrelationship with them that's kind of, it's actually very confusing and not easy to understand. Ultimately, they're both controlled by Miscavige to the point where it sort of doesn't matter. But those entities are going to always be the last liable anyway, because they have the least day-to-day involvement with the money that between the parishioners and the orgs. I mean, there's just so many layers, so many buffers before you get there.
Right.
That the entities that are going to be liable are going to be the front groups. They're going to be the orgs, the ideal orgs. And so it's always tough to get there.
Yeah, for sure. And just so people who aren't tracking with all of this and how this all works, because it is difficult to understand, there is a simple explanation, or fairly simple explanation, of at least the framework of it, which is that you have RTC, the Religious Technology Center, which is the nominal holder of the trademarks and copyrights of Scientology, and that is when we refer to David Miscavige as the chairman of the board, he is the chairman of the board of RTC. Right. Then you have CST, which is the Church of Spiritual Technology, which is in charge of Hubbard's, all of his written and spoken works being put into permanent archival, storage in these dugout holes in the ground that they have in New Mexico, California, Wyoming, different places. And that's basically what CST does on a day-to-day basis that we know of. But they have, legally, they have the ability to buy all the trademarks from RTC for $1 or something like that. There's some relationship there.
They're the true owner of the intellectual property, and really RTC is just the licensee. But because they share this almost symbiotic relationship, it kind of doesn't matter so long as those corporations are effectively operating in tandem.
Right. And you have the board members, with pre-dated or undated letters of resignation in Miscavige's hands or something. This is an old Hubbard trick, where you can basically fire them at any point because you got these undated letters saying you resign. And so Miscavige really controls all of this. And then I think the part that I've had conversations with others about on this is the tricky part is the glue that holds all this together is the Sea Organization, which is a non-corporate, non-membership entity that doesn't have any real legal status or basis. And yet, in the real world, David Miscavige is the leader of the Sea Org and therefore the guy who runs all these people. And trying to explain that relationship is somehow very, very tricky in a courtroom, because everybody in the courtrooms are used to board members who run things and having charters and having, corporations set up the way corporations are set up. And that's not really how Scientology runs.
Right. Yeah, no, so, it's by design, I think.
Yeah.
And, important to note that corporate structure came about as a as a result of the ongoing IRS litigation. It really was part of the settlement that they would restructure themselves as they did. It was slightly different before, and now it's this. And this just happens to be much more complicated, much more impenetrable, much more frustrating.
Very. Yeah, very. And very difficult to get around. And as we know from the testimony of Larry Brennan, or rather Denise Brennan, who actually put all this stuff together, he flat out said, look, if you're trying to figure all this stuff out, you're falling into our trap already, because none of this has anything to do with how Scientology is actually run.
Right. And it's really just run by one person. And, and that's become more and more obvious as the defections over time, any challenger has been sort of ousted the way Saddam Hussein or, Kim Jong-un, handle things.
Yep.
And his lawyers have been a little standing there.
Right. Yeah. Pretty goofy stuff. But let me ask you this: as a lawyer and as somebody who's more familiar with this stuff by far than I am, what would be some scenarios where Miscavige, as the leader of Scientology, could end up in a courtroom, like for real, being deposed, being asked the hard questions? How does such a thing come about? Because so far he's been very good at avoiding that.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I know for a fact that one of the things that terrifies Scientology's lawyers is the generification of the Scientology trademark. If other competing churches could start using Scientology, and I think I've written about this before and tried to poke free zone and independent organizations into going that route, and a few have made feints in that direction. That is something that really only he could answer. In a setting where he would have to defend why Scientology isn't generic, but the term Catholic isn't necessarily. No one can actually use that. The Catholic Church can't come after you for using the term Catholic necessarily.
Okay, right.
If Scientology is open to the masses, then the Church of Scientology proper loses its price controls, really. They will not be able to charge as much if somebody else could undercut them. And, of course, they would have the same arguments that they already do, that you're not getting the true, heroin,
right. It's not the good stuff, man. It's not pure.
Right. But that definitely terrifies them, that could happen, and they would, and that is something that I think only he would be able to. I think that's something that you could get him into a courtroom on.
Okay.
What else? Annulment. If there was a tax exempt challenge, and that's a whole other ball of wax. The Sklars came the closest in recent years. They were a Jewish couple who argued that because Scientologists were able to deduct their auditing costs, they should be allowed to deduct their Jewish school tuition. They lost that argument, but in the process of making that argument, they were inherently challenging the settlement agreement. And the IRS went to the mattresses basically to protect that agreement. But if that agreement came under attack, if you could somehow open up the agreement, which is still secret, by the way, I'm not sure if you realize that it's known. It was published in the Wall Street Journal, but it's never been it's never been acknowledged by either the IRS or Scientology that it is what it purports to be in the Wall Street Journal. So, so just getting it acknowledged would even be a landmark, because the IRS was only talking about it in the Sklar case in the hypothetical sense, which so we're not even there yet, but ultimately, and we know for a fact, we know through numerous witnesses, firsthand witnesses, that the money goes to Miscavige, who can use it as he pleases. And the money, sometimes the money goes to Tom Cruise even. I mean, and you can actually make the case that, and in fact, it's actually an easier case to make because Tom Cruise doesn't have an official position. Miscavige can always argue that, as head of church, he can do whatever he wants. Benny Hinn, the televangelist, is about to have to make that argument. Yeah. And Scientology watchers should probably keep an eye out on the Benny Hinn case. Although I have a feeling, as much money as Benny Hinn has, he's amateur hour next to the money that and the corporate structure too that Scientology employs.
Right. Well, we like to make fun of Monique Yingling going on TV and making an ass of herself defending Scientology, but she is been her and her, I guess, former husband. I think he died. But that that couple and the tax attorneys that Scientology brings to bear do know how to do their job.
Yeah. I mean, it's a point I occasionally make in the comments sections in various places where a lot of people try to suggest that Scientology once again has shot itself in the foot through these lawyer tactics, but talk to me in 3 months after they've worked. I mean, ultimately, they get paid a lot of money to do what turns out to be a very good job. As dumb as those arguments seem, a lot of judges are really, really hesitant to go there. So all these First Amendment blockades that they put up, they sound ridiculous in theory. How can every Sea Org member be a minister under the ministerial exception in the Laura D case, for instance? Yeah. They can't really, but a judge doesn't want to touch it, and they know also, judges know that Scientology will appeal. I mean, no matter what. Right. Your case is going to have to be buttoned up. And so even for judges face a resource challenge. They only have so many clerks. They only have so many, so much time to devote. They have a busy docket, and I'm not saying that makes it right. I'm just telling you what the reality is, that, if you're Scientology litigates a lot like say Exxon would in court. The difference is there's usually and Exxon's used to fighting with, Texaco or who, they might all be merged. I don't know. But what I'm saying is Scientology operates like a mega rich litigant would, where everything is going to be appealed and as a matter of just doing business. This is how we settle this big, issue. Yeah. But the difference with Scientology is that there's, the Garcias, a couple at the, on the other side of the docket, on the other side of the caption in that case. They're just people, and Scientology is going to litigate it like a big corporation would, and spend $1,000 to get your $1 if it means being able to say that they won, or that you're a criminal, or whatever the goal happened to be.
Right. Okay, now this actually leads right into my next area that I wanted to get into with you, and I think it's the area that most people are aware of. Like this is in the United States especially, this is just a thing. Everybody knows that this thing exists, and yet they don't really understand, again, how the practicalities of it work in a courtroom, and that is the First Amendment. There are people who dedicate their lives to constitutional law and to proper interpretation of the amendment. And the First Amendment covers a lot of stuff. And freedom of religion is one of those things. It shall not be infringed upon, right? So how far, from your experience, I know you're not a constitutional lawyer, but you've observed this, so how far does the First Amendment protection go for a church like Scientology?
Well, it goes pretty far. Like, I was talking in legal realist terms just before about how do you know how you game the system, but there's a lot of favorable law to them, and that law has changed over time to become more favorable to them, even in the last bunch of years. The First Amendment, the origins of it really are a reaction to the Church of England. Most of the colonists here had a bad memory of how that operated. And it wasn't just that the Church of England was able to dictate religion, but if you read Madison and Jefferson, they noticed that the Church of England degraded religion. Religion wasn't as important a part of life as it was for the colonists. But at the beginning, the colonists also had, there weren't just Christians. There were all sorts of brands of Christians. They were mostly Christians, though. Because of that situation, there was a sort of détente, and when they drew up the First Amendment, which doesn't just have a free exercise clause, it also has an establishment clause, which is really, there's two sides of the same coin, really. The free exercise clause prohibits the government from interfering with your religious practice, and the establishment clause prohibits the government from becoming entangled with religion somehow through, passing various laws. They couldn't just fund Christianity, a Catholic church, for instance. That détente enabled the drafters to create the Establishment Clause, which prevented the government from choosing one or the other brand of Christianity. Right. And what's happened over time, and you can see that, even though there are fewer Quakers and Puritans, now than there were then, what eventually developed was a distrust between Catholicism and Protestantism. And so if you look at when most of the First Amendment religion clause laws were passed in the mid 1900s, you'll see that distrust, the dominant Protestant distrust against the Catholic, papists, there was a genuine fear, but that's since collapsed a lot. There's not as much. Most of the flavors of Christianity are on the same page, to the point where they're all just fine now with taking government money however they can get it, school vouchers, however it comes to them. And so really the evangelicals were the loudest strain of Christianity, have sort of won out. And with that, like I said, the free exercise clause and the establishment clause are sort of, one comes at the expense of the other. And what's sort of happened is there's been a very broader interpretation of the free exercise clause at the expense of the establishment clause over the years, which used to, at one point, the establishment clause was the dominant half, and now it's not. And Scientology is largely the beneficiary of that because you can't make a law necessarily. I mean, as a judge, you can't just make a law against Scientology so long as they're
right.
a bona fide religion. And we can get into what that means. You might curtail some of the other free exercise jurisprudence that's come down the pipe,
right.
Over the years. So there's a real hesitancy by judges to go there.
Right, and I think that's where people get the most. I think that's where they're really shocked, is that you have forced abortions, you have slave labor conditions, and you really have these things. This is not hyperbole. Right. I mean, I lived it, right? I know that this is not, people are not exaggerating when they talk about barbed wire fences, security guards, a prison of the mind, a prison of fear. I mean, these things are real. And yet it all gets excused in a courtroom, or at least it appears to, through the argument that, well, they're willing members of our religious faith and therefore are subject to our religious guidelines and practices, and therefore we are untouchable. And that seems to be really what it comes down to. Yeah. So now, is that true? And what I say is what I just said. Is that really where the judges go with that?
I mean, there's no. It's a tough thing to generalize because there are boundaries. I mean, unfortunately, in the Laura D case, for instance, we just haven't gotten to that issue. In the Headley's case, which is very similar, we didn't get there because of statute of limitations. I mean, that's another thing, actually, like the scavenged fears is like, if we expanded the statute of limitations for some of these things or made broader exceptions, so that things hold later, because what happens, especially in Scientology, there's this, as soon as ex-members leave, there's this sort of shell shock, stasis that happens where they can't really do anything. They don't feel empowered to do anything.
Yeah.
They've been demoralized over the years, and it takes a while, as you know, to like climb out of that. And when they do, then they start thinking about, and not many do, but the ones who do start thinking about, going back to church and righting wrongs, it may be too late. So that's a whole other.
I didn't realize that the statute of limitations had entered in on the Headley's case. I thought it was dismissed purely on the First Amendment issues.
I think that was a ministerial exception, but I think there were issues. I think not all issues that, and again, this is really just a lot of information, pushing other information out. I'm pretty sure, I know statute of limitations came up in the Laura D case quite a bit.
Yes.
And I know that the cases were similar, and I know that I believe that some of the issues in Headley were time barred and maybe just not the subject of, and maybe they weren't fought over just because of that reason. But, generally speaking, if we extended the statute of limitations, and statute of limitations is really a state by state thing. If statute of limitations were extended for a variety of things, you would have the opportunity for more, litigation.
Okay. And I think also maybe one big difference between Laura D's case and the Headley's case, because the Headleys definitely went for the jugular with human rights violations and human trafficking. And maybe they went too far. I think that's what I've read about it. But I think the key difference between those two cases, and maybe what gives Laura D's case more legs, is that she was a minor when the things that she's claiming occurred.
Right.
And,
I think actually, I think it was ignored in Claire's case, I think there were claims that involved time when she was a minor, and those were given short shrift in the appeal. I forget at what stage. I'm really generalizing about a very specific thing, and I apologize for that. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm pretty sure in the Headley's case too, there were issues that of her, there were incidents that in that timeline when she was a minor, and that should have come up probably.
Right. Okay. Well, on this same line of thinking, I wanted to ask you about this as well. I was not aware until after I did a podcast or a video a couple months ago that the undue influence thing, I don't know what to call it, law, statute, I don't know, but it was used effectively in an appeal by Ford Green in a California case to win this case on appeal. Undue influence is usually a business thing, as I understand it. It's not. No, actually, it's so much.
It comes up most often in estate will contests where, and it's actually a very useful thing to understand, because similar stuff happens in Scientology with respect to disconnection, but 85-year-old marries a 35-year-old. The 35-year-old manages to change the will, cutting the children out. 85-year-old dies a year later. Now the children of the 85-year-old they're naturally gonna say that was undue influence. Like he didn't really want to disinherit us. You're just stealing his money. Her money. I didn't want to, I mean, I don't
sure.
There, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean that happens a lot. It happens a lot in the state cases. And I read a little bit about what New Jersey's doing with something that sounds a lot like undue influence, called predatory alienation. And I'm not completely hopeful, because what it looks like to me is just a bill to study a thing which is which has no force of law whatsoever. But the fact that it's being talked about is interesting, and I have to think too. It sort of reminds me though of I guess that like the term brainwashing became passé, went out with the Cult Awareness Network, because it's impossible to define.
Right.
And what I'm wondering is, what is, I don't quite know what predatory alienation is that undue influence doesn't already get you. It sounds to me like the same kind of thing. The basis for the, how you would test it in court, would probably be about the same. But the predatory, I guess the one difference that I did notice was that predatory alienation, did seem to refer to disconnection. I think this law is probably on Scientology's radar. I know they don't have a big presence in New Jersey, but they'll probably want to kill it. What happens? What often happens in one state adopts something, another state adopts it.
Right.
35 have adopted something similar. And I don't know quite what it was meant to address. I don't think it was meant to address Scientology.
Not specifically, but it was meant to address religious undue influence. That's for sure.
Oh, it was. So there is because I looked for the word religion in the context of the, what the bill talked about, and I didn't see it, but
oh, maybe that is an add-in from the article that I read about it rather than the bill itself.
Right. Well,
but it could be used in that respect.
Right. Yeah. It's better than nothing. The fact that the fact that it's like a new term that is maybe gaining currency. I guess we'll just have to see, how that goes.
Well, for sure, because I know that, we're trying to work within the structure of our Constitution. And like we just talked about with the First Amendment, there are issues there. There are hurdles to get over in order to bring what you would call justice to people who can't seem to get it because of the structure of the First Amendment protections. And I've been told by a couple people in European countries, where they don't have those same hurdles, that they're better over there at, going after predatory alienation situations or, undue influence situations, because they recognize it legally more, or it's easier to bring into the courtroom. Have you witnessed any of that, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, Europe doesn't have a First Amendment. They have, some countries have a rough equivalent. I'm not really an expert there, so I don't want to venture too far outside my lane. But yeah, I mean, it really just comes down to them being much more wary of fringe groups, whereas here we equate them with freedom, I guess,
Yeah. It's a tricky line, because you want freedom of thought, you want freedom of belief, you don't want totalitarianism at all. And there's so many abuses that a government bureaucracy will bring into almost anything when given the opportunity to trample on people's rights. And just historically, like we know this happens. So you want to err on the side of giving groups and giving people the freedom to do what they want, or, have the ideas they want to have. And yet you look at these abuses and you just go, wow, how can this be, Have you ever thought about this in terms of systemically we might do in order to deal with this?
Well, I've always, and I've written about this, I think in Forbes. I mean, I made the argument that, Scientology should lose its tax exemption, not because it's not a religion. And I think a lot of people get caught up in is Scientology a religion or not? And it's kind of a moot question here, because the government doesn't care whether you're a religion or not. They care whether you're a church or not, a tax exempt church. And if you're operating as a tax exempt church without a religious purpose, and these are all terms of art, you can lose your tax exempt status. And I think that would grind things to a halt if they lost their tax exempt status.
Yeah.
And the types of things that you can do to lose your tax exempt status, or activity like against the public good, in the sense of disconnection, for instance, the aggressive private investigation stuff that goes on. I mean, there's just a laundry list. The really tough stuff is to get to throw into that basket is the stuff, the RPF stuff. I mean, it's because that's going to fall under autonomy, and those people's at the time wish to continue that. I forget who, somebody recently mentioned the fact that even if you went into the hole, if you brought the FBI to the hole,
right,
no one would leave. Is
Mike Rinder said that. Mike Rinder said that.
Right. And that was perfectly accurate. And so it's really tough to get, that's definitely like a non-religious purpose, but try to get that on the record, at the time, is just kind of it's really difficult.
It's very difficult because it takes people getting out of that prison of belief before they start twigging on what's actually going on to them. And
Right.
so when they're in the middle of it, and this is something that watchers tend to not get is, they comment, well, I would never put up with that for a second. I'd punch Miscavige in the face. And you go, well, of course you would. That's the proper sane response to an insane situation these people are in. But they're part of the insanity when they're part of it. So they're not seeing and thinking clearly. And so if you went in there with the trucks and said, okay, we're here to free you, they'd be like, free me from what? This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And it's crazy
Right.
making that this
total
goes
freedom.
on.
Can't you see it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of...
So this is the...
Yeah, so it's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Let me...
But just just getting back to the point of
Yeah.
what would lose them. A key case was Bob Jones University, where they had they were a religion. They're still a religious entity. Bob Jones. I mean, it's sort of like Jim Baker. It's a televangelist inspired university that had a policy against interracial dating, and that's why they lost their tax exempt status, is because the IRS was basically, you are a religion, that's fine, but discrimination trumps that, and you lose. They only just recently reapplied for that. I think that was in the early 90s. They lost their tax exempt status, but that's really the line. That's there is there's I guess there's discrimination in Scientology, but there's really nothing on. I mean, there's African Americans in positions. I mean, you can't, it's not the same as what Bob Jones was doing, which was a very concrete example of discrimination. And I don't think that necessarily exists in Scientology, a parallel to that. But you do have the disconnection. You do have, the retaliation against critics. I'm trying to think of what else. I mean, there's plenty of other, arguments against them.
Well, I'll tell you one discrimination suit that would probably have legs, although it would take a while to dig into the details and the minutia to out it, would be their discrimination against LGBT. But I don't know, how strong a civil, action that would be at this point in time, although I think it would be timely. But they are very definitely, I mean, my own personal experience, I could testify to it, that, if you are LGBT, you are not treated equally in the Church of Scientology. And that is a case that could be made.
That's interesting. I'm aware of that. That would face two hurdles right away. One is that LGBT discrimination classification isn't seen as egregious as race-based classification, which goes back to the 13th and 14th Amendments. But and what else? And it's also, if you're, I think if you're just denying people on the basis, denying people of advancement within the church, I'm pretty sure that that's not going to ever come into play. I mean, this is like the discrimination that was going on Bob Jones was so much more, holistic, I guess. I don't know the word, but it was more all encompassing. Where anybody attending that university knew in advance that they couldn't actually date somebody of the other race. But
pretty in your face discrimination. Scientology is much more covert about it.
Right.
Yeah. That's why it would take drilling down into the details, and I don't know that it would really have legs. But all right.
There's also the mistreatment of children would also be another. Yeah, I mean, we already touched on that a little bit. There's also,
Yeah,
coerced abortions would also be a non-religious purpose.
yeah,
The maintenance of fair game, which is sort of hinted at. Um, and I would also throw annulment into that, which is just, which is how the Church of Scientology originally lost its tax
that's
exempt
right.
status. Was Hubbard? They found
That's
that
right.
Hubbard was making, was directly benefiting in a personal way.
Yep.
And you can say the same thing about the scavenge, most certainly, if if you could afford to make the argument, basically.
Right. Exactly. Brings us back to the beginning. Well, let me wrap this up with this then, because we've covered a lot of territory and we've covered some good stuff here, and I really appreciate your time on this. So the last question that again is commonly asked, is commonly looked at, and I'm wondering again from a legal standpoint, what's your take on why the U.S. government won't step in to do something about Scientology? What's holding them back? I mean, we have reports that, there was an FBI investigation occurring, and then suddenly, I mean, they were within a day or two, I think, of going into the int base, and there was various things moving forward on that, and then suddenly, nope, the whole thing dropped, right? And
yeah, I mean, I think for the same reasons I mentioned, resource allocation. I'm not gonna get too far into the conspiracy weeds, but I wouldn't put it past Scientology to put as much pressure on that they could put to bear on the law enforcement agencies in question, however that occurs, because we've seen it in retrospect in a lot of cases.
mm-hmm.
But basically, that you're going to get like an endless fight on your hands. That's never going to go away. They're going to challenge every step of the way. They're already, they're in a gray zone. There's, even when they, negligently kill someone, like they still, they control so much of, the scene or immediately after that, that you just really can't get, any headway as an investigator. And I think probably somebody higher up than the original investigating agent at the FBI probably said, this is just we're going to pick our battles and this isn't one. So, I mean, I think that's really what we just see time and time again is that we find an interested FBI agent, or, law enforcement agency anywhere. And, they get interested in it and they realize that it's, it's probably, it would require biting off a lot more than they do.
Yeah, exactly. It looks simple to start with, but once you start getting into the minutia of it, it becomes this monstrosity. And then how do you fight that? And it's frustrating. It's frustrating for us as critics, as people who try to do something about it. But I've always sort of had the idea, or at least I've not always had, but I've had for a couple of years now, the idea that, that the war against Scientology, or whatever battle it is that you, however you want to characterize it, the struggle to end the abuses is really what the war is. It's, will you please stop abusing people so much? Is a battle of education and PR, not a battle that is going to be won on the legal front. Sort of been my take on it, and I kind of get this that you agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think at one point, a lot of the ex-Scientologists that I've met, and I've met many, you can tell a lot by the time about them from the time that they entered and left, because Scientology was pitching one thing to people, and they were allowed to pitch to people in a way that they were immunized from, critical scrutiny, pre-internet, and then the internet sort of, made it sort of impossible for, for people, for them to get, decent people here, which is why they're looking, to third world countries and using the, a lot of the people in Clearwater I see are most likely not, they're here on visas. And I know that,
Mm-hmm.
I think Jeff Jacobson did a lot of good research into that way back when.
Right.
And so, yeah, like I said at the beginning, I think they can exist without members, but I think we're approaching that. I mean, I think we're just, it's always going to be a handful, but, if we can starve them from, critical mass of members, then eventually they'll just, die off on their own accord.
I think that's the direction it's going in. Well, Scott, thank you very much for your time on this. I'm glad we finally hooked up and made this happen. And again, really appreciate your expertise on this and your answers.
Yes. Thanks, Chris.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's wrap up the show here. Guys, thanks a lot for coming around, listening, watching. Really appreciate your support and viewership. And of course, if you want to support this podcast and my channel, join me on Patreon at patreon.com/Chris Shelton, or show me some love through PayPal or whatever. Please do like and share this podcast all over the interwebs, and we will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.